Just sharing Keynote. Just sharing Keynote. And if people can mute themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Udran Zebik. I'm head of research at Entro, and thank you for joining us today for what will hopefully be a lively conversation examining how COVID will redefine placemaking. As I sit here in my home, making careful eye contact with my webcam, and my laptop is precariously stacked on top of a bunch of textbooks, I'm struck at how different this conversation we're about to have would have been 2 months ago. First of all, we probably wouldn't have been having this conversation, but more than that, COVID and the current pandemic has really redefined how we engage with one another and our relationship to the built environment and how we engage with places. Since COVID affects each and every one of us, it is our aim to add the perspective of designers and strategists to the conversations, to explore how we shape and design spaces moving forward, to create COVID resistant and resilient spaces. And today we're going to try to really dig deep into some of these approaches, how we can create design in the post-COVID world and create place in the post-COVID world. In the first 45 minutes, our panel will discuss a range of topics, including how COVID is forcing us to rethink community, identity, and belonging, and the implication this will have on placemaking within the built environment. Finally, we will also explore how new technologies, both in the digital and physical realm, will influence placemaking. We're hopeful that this conversation today will bring forth questions and comments from the audience. So the last 15 minutes of today's session will be left for audience questions. So if you do have a question, there is a SurveyMonkey link to the right of the video. In addition, I believe the link is also in the Eventbrite, email you might have received yesterday. Submit questions throughout, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can at the end. For those of you that are wondering, the session today will be recorded and made available after the fact, so I guess I have to be on my best behavior. And one small note before we continue, unfortunately, due to a last-minute scheduling conflict, we are down to 4 panelists. The good news is that it gives each of our panelists a little bit more screen time. Since we are very much all in this together, our panelists represent a range of perspectives and backgrounds, and I will introduce them in a second. If you do have any technical issues in regards to submitting the questions through SurveyMonkey, feel free to contact Christina. Her email is right there up on the screen, and I believe her email was in the email correspondence you might have received from us prior to today's webinar session. To introduce our panelists, we have 4 panelists with a range of backgrounds and perspectives, and welcome panelists. First, we have Brad Keast. Brad is the Vice President of Innovation and Development at Dream Unlimited. With a background in systems engineering and real estate development, Brad is a hands-on senior real estate executive and social infrastructure board director. He has built and led international teams through design and construction, engineering, investment analysis, communications and branding, as well as a large multidisciplinary external consultant teams. Hey, Brad, how you doing? I think you're still
good, thanks. Yeah,
okay.
Good, thank you.
No problem. Next, we have Daniel Payne. Daniel Payne is a principal in the New York office of AEA Consulting, a strategy and planning firm for the cultural and creative industries. Daniel's background merges architecture, design, and business, and he applies those skills to develop new programming and facility concepts for arts organizations, create placemaking strategies for districts and cities, develop financial models and business plans, space plans and capital project feasibility studies, and facilitate strategic and cultural planning processes. Hey, Daniel, how you doing?
Hi.
I'm loving the background,
well.
by the way.
Thanks.
Good. Next, we have Anna Crider. Anna Crider is the principal at Entro's New York office, as well as the board president of the Society for Experiential Design, SCGD, excuse me. With over 18 years of industry experience, Anna has led diverse national and international design projects for the built environment, including wayfinding, donor recognition, placemaking systems, interactive media, print, and identity design. Hi, Anna.
Adrienne.
And finally, we have Tim Robertson. Tim Robertson is the co-founder of Good Digital Culture based in Toronto. Tim's background brings together technology and design thinking to reimagine the role of digital for both in-product and experience design. He has overseen experiential virtual exhibits for international arts institutions and transformation of analog engagement tools to data-driven platforms for NGOs. Hi, Tim.
Hey.
All right, welcome everyone. So let's kick this off. I think it's quite easy to say and easy for all of us to see that COVID has thrown a wrench into our ability to socialize and interact in the environment, and that it's affecting how we think about community, engage with the built environment. So I guess the first question or topic that I would like us to explore is, whether this shift has resulted in an increased appreciation of community identity and belonging in the post-COVID world. So Anna, I'm hoping you could kick us off with this first question.
Sure. I mean, I would say and start off with, I think our idea of community has really transitioned. 6 weeks ago, the norm was really to email. We barely picked up the phone, and now we've invited our clients and colleagues into our homes and allowed them to see us virtually through video. But we've, in some ways, currently are more connected globally because we are experiencing for the first time the same thing, which is very rare, that everyone across the globe is really suffering through the same challenges. So I would say our sense of community globally has really strengthened, but we're disconnected currently from our community because there's fear just to walk down the street. I think this transition is going to continue, and our connection to community is going to become actually hyper local. And so as we start to transition back into the outdoors, and our communities, really our role as designers is going to be to help people feel safe and to be safe. And so I think that's really going to be the next wave of this, is hyper local sense of community. And then eventually that transition will go again now globally, but we first have to get through the next hurdle of walking outside of our door and feeling connected again with our local community.
So what is, please.
No, I was going to say, I mean, just to, tag on the idea of sort of global community that you talked about there. And I think, one of the important things that we thinking about a little bit is, how you can start to scale up some of the small things that I think you normally think of as community actions, or, taking care of one another for the people that you see on a regular basis in your lives, to a broader scale. And while, obviously, we acknowledge that, there's differences in who, gets to enjoy webinars and who gets to do, work from home versus, who are still on the front lines and, going into their places of work on a day-to-day basis. Everybody sort of being a part of this experience, whether you're in, Asia, Europe, the US, hopefully they don't quite have the spread in some of the parts of the developing world that we've seen here. But, it's an opportunity for us all to unite together and press forward together, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I would say just one thing that's almost, so it's interesting that we are definitely all going through this together, but when you see a lot in the news, just the comparison of how different countries and different regions, and even probably down at the city level, are approaching the response to COVID. And it almost, I think it parallels sort of this anti-globalization movement that we're starting to see. And the idea of, well, look what Sweden's doing, look what Korea is doing, look what the US is doing, all very, very different approaches. And so it's almost creating a bit of a tension or competition between them. And I think that maybe sort of at the country level, maybe splitting things apart a little bit. And I think when you get down more granular to sort of the individuals, and I think who we see as our community might be changing a little bit. And the idea of being in sort of with large crowded spaces with a whole bunch of strangers, I think a lot of people are sort of obviously are being forced to now, but I think psychologically will be sort of retreating into something that they're much more comfortable with. And I think through that, you may even see sort of a reverse migration of sorts from cities out into suburbs, even farther afield. And I think for a number of reasons, one, proving that work from home works and you don't need to be in town as much, but also just that isolation, that buffer from others.
So Brad, could you elaborate a little bit? Oh, sorry, please, Tim, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think I agree with Brad. I think that on kind of a professional level, companies are starting to kind of cross borders much more easily through things like Zoom. But I think when you think about the sense of community, if you think of it at a national level, you are seeing these tensions between countries looking and comparing themselves. And I think that that's a dangerous trend and also an interesting trend when we think about how it's now going to emphasize those borders. Physical borders have been shut down, and obviously they will reopen, but mentally it has put that in the back of people's minds that this kind of abstract idea of a national border is quite tangible when it comes down to it. So I think this idea of community in terms of national identity, and then again, as Brad was saying, then when you look at the local level, if you look at small town Nova Scotia versus downtown Toronto, there seems to be a very different sense of how we are approaching this. So then all of a sudden we have these kind of micro communities within the country that are having a very different experience of this global experience. So as much as I think it is bringing people together on certain levels, in particular professional levels, I think at an individual level, it's actually dividing us in a lot of ways, which I think is a design challenge of how will we move forward and how will we approach that as designers and as a people.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, in regards to these kind of smaller micro communities and this notion of hyper locality, what is, I guess, how do we think about the importance for these places to have a sense of brand or sense of identity to define themselves within the larger context? Brad and Tim, maybe you two could speak to that a little.
I think it's a good question. I think there's a number of different opportunities in there. One, if we're talking hyper local in terms of local establishments, retailers, food and beverage, et cetera, obviously, in order for them to be viable, they have to operate a profitable business. So all of the usual sort of marketing, design, branding, all of those pieces need to come into play there. And it needs to be attracting enough people from, be it, even if it is a hyper local area and people are walking, it needs to be able to attract enough people. But I think on the more sort of going up a level to different communities, I think there's an opportunity for suburbs that they've always been the place next to the city. They can now become their own city in a way. They can sort of succeed and have their own identity that's a little stronger. And I think that's being driven a lot by this massive work from home experiment that we're seeing that has proven mixed success. There's definitely things that can be done at home, and there's definitely things that a lot of people are missing, being either away from home and all of the different distractions that come with that or obligations, and being with your team that you normally would be at work. And so I think that will give rise to the ability for people to spend more time in the suburb or even farther communities, and it gives them a really good opportunity to flourish on their own.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say in the response to the local community, I agree that there's the opportunity for them to become more individual and have more of a presence. However, I think that's happening naturally with this pandemic, where these kind of communities are becoming highly defined. And I almost think that the challenge isn't going to be how do they keep their individuality. It will be how do we encourage people to cross those borders within their communities when there's this psychological phenomenon happening that's telling you not to enter other communities. And I think that's actually going to be a real challenge, at least in the short and medium term, of kind of encouraging people to not self-isolate and to not isolate communities from each other.
And to pick up on that, Tim, I think, there's an interesting tension in there between sort of this, impulse of control when we've got, sickness and, even death around us. And some of the solidarity or compassion that we've seen as a part of, smaller scale communities right now. And I think, ensuring that we come out on the other side, continuing to think about what the real sense of place is, or what community identities are, and that creativity is a real important part of that, is really important to be thinking about and to be very forward about as we're talking about these things, or else, I mean, I think there is a chance it could be lost, whether it's because of, expediency of measures in the short term to, trace contacts or things like that. And as we all know, after, 9/11, a lot of those things don't easily go away, or whether it's just because we're sort of rushing to get back to normal and we start to ignore some of the small elements that, can contribute so much to place and our connection to one another. So, using this, intervening pause as an opportunity to think about the things that can support these, I think are really important for all of us and designers and creators.
Thank you, Daniel. I feel like maybe that brings us to our next question, which is this notion of how we get from the current situation where we are currently in regards to the pandemic and become more comfortable with, leaving our homes, exploring our communities, so on and so forth, and experiencing place more fully. So I guess the question there is, how do technologies provide us with new opportunities for placemaking? So technologies both in the digital realm and technologies that exist within the physical environments. What are the opportunities for placemaking that can be supported through new technologies? And I wonder, Tim, if you could touch on that a little bit.
Sure. I think when we think about technology in placemaking and in response to the pandemic, there's kind of two specific areas we can look at. We can look at health and safety, which I think kind of falls under accessibility, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then there's the other, which is technology within the physical space and interacting with people outside of the need to kind of think about safety. So if we think about technology in the physical environment as far as interacting, I think what this is doing is giving us opportunity to look at existing technologies we've had available to us, but they've never really been leveraged in a way. And a lot of the reason they haven't been leveraged is because there is a technology hurdle where people just aren't comfortable. Because we've been in this for a couple of months, it might be several months, this has given everybody an opportunity to become familiar with technology like video technology, where we're used to using it passively and now all of a sudden it's active. So I think there's a big opportunity to start to explore the things like video in place, not as a passive experience, but something you engage with. I think there's also technologies like radar and motion detector, and how do we make sensory experiences but using technology, but in a more human way that allows people to feel connected, even if physically we have space around us. So I think the technology is really about leveraging existing technologies in new ways, and I think that's a really exciting place for designers to start to play and see what they can do with those technologies.
I'd say, like, as a counter to that, in some ways, we've all been in a way inundated with technology, and there is a desire to now come back out and actually have physical contact with our spaces and one another. And so I think we need to strategize also and curate, what does that mean in terms of, we have the temporary measures, even at Entro, we're working with Arcanis in terms of looking at seat coverings for in airports to help create that divide, but that's a temporary fix. We need to start curating nonverbal cues and in a way, behavioral nudges to start having social distancing within our spaces that are not just a cue. It's going to be more of the museum spaces, the parks, spaces where we're free flowing, and really thinking about where can we use placemaking to guide someone in one way versus another. Do we reconfigure furniture to create more of a path that's defined in a way that's going to create that level of social distancing? Do we think about curating exhibits so that they are more of a one-to-one or a small group? So we're thinking about containing that. So I think we have the digital realm that's absolutely, I think there's been amazing content coming out, but now how do we counter that with other improvements that are maybe more financially achievable also for cultural institutions, because we certainly can't get all of them to be able to afford that.
I think there's definitely that question about feasibility and the cost associated with some of these technologies. Daniel, would you like to take us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, working with cultural institutions is a large part of our work on a day-to-day basis, and thinking about small scale cultural entities and being able to make some of the changes that we're asking just the same as, cities, states, large corporations who have, large budgets and cash on hand, I think is going to be challenging. And so ways that, we can think about, either, helping them obviously financially is one part of it, but also, making these things more digestible, or, being able to be phased in incrementally while, at the same time, of course, ensuring the health and safety of, people who might be coming to these places in the future, or in, even in the short term, staff and artists who are working in them, I think is really important. It's totally, different ask for your, $1 million cultural organization to do some, put up temperature scanners, for example, versus, large scale, property managers, or, Google or Apple on their campuses, things like that. So, it's something definitely to be mindful of, and it's part of a design challenge, I think, for sure.
And also, I think even before implementing any of those, in the technology, be it hi-fi, lo-fi, we still need to have people feel comfortable and feel safe, that it's okay to go out. And I think a big part of that comes down to, like almost any problem comes down to, it's a communication issue. And so how do you communicate everything is okay, and what does that mean for organizations like the public institutions, or even just out in public spaces like parks? Do you need to, if you're taking your child to a play set, is there certain information that you want to know around when was it last cleaned, and do you want to know who else has been using it? That gets into obviously all sorts of interesting privacy issues, but I think fundamentally we need to find ways for people to feel safe and that it's okay to go and socialize again.
Yeah, and I'd say that's where there's going to be a level of graphics that are communicating certain protocols, but then there's also going to be those moments of just seeing a level of nonverbal cues, and that if the hand sanitizer thing is there, we suddenly feel like the space is clean and people are following the rules, right? So I think that will be the balance, just to kind of tie back to what I was saying earlier, where we have to see what are the moments that communicate beyond just a big poster of do this, don't.
And I would also hope that, there's still an opportunity for, artists and designers and creators to, inject a little bit of excitement and energy into these things as well, and to give a sense of, while you feel comfortable and safe, there's still a bit of unexpected amid all this, because I think, that's a critical element, is if you're thinking about place, that you're not just encountering sort of the same surfaces over and over, the same signs over and over, but that there's something unique about this area or this place where getting something different. And so that's an opportunity again, I think, for people to inject a little bit of something interesting.
And I think on the personal protection side, you're already seeing that there's artist edition face masks, and
right.
a lot of people at home using 3D printers to create face shields. I think initially that part is more just on the practical for trying to help frontline workers, but I think you'll never stop the human creativity, which is a wonderful thing, and you'll see more of this happening, and it'll either become trendy, or at least it'll feel less intrusive, having to wear PPE, at least in the short term.
Yeah, and I'd say, to loop back to this shared sense of community, what's really been coming out is that there's been a lot of crowdsourcing and a lot of people rolling up their sleeves and innovating and finding new means of solving these new challenges without borders in terms of competition. I feel there's been a lot of community input across sectors and across competitors to really solve these challenges. So I do think the artist, the way of making someone feel safe in an environment as well as be safe, the balance is there, that they're both important. So we have to really roll up our sleeves and figure that out.
Yeah, I feel this is going to really require some interesting design solutions, in the sense that there's this tension between providing an environment that is safe and where your behavior is regimented and controlled, while at the same time providing, like Daniel said, the notion of that we can experience fun, engaging, emotionally connective, I suppose, environments. So I feel that's where, you know, behavioral nudging and smart, good design ends up kind of fitting in between those, where you feel safe within the environment, but you know, you're within an environment that you actually want to spend time in and you feel you can engage and connect with. So I feel that's where probably design is going to be super important as we move forward in this post-pandemic world, for sure. Okay, I also wonder, we touched on this very briefly. I think, Tim, you mentioned it in your first response to this question. This notion of safety and the fact that there's an increased need for disinfection and non-physical interaction within the built environment. What impact will this have on accessible and universal design? And Daniel, maybe you can lead us off on this one.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose my initial thought is, you know, things we touched on earlier. One is that there's, you know, increased operational costs with a lot of these things. And, you know, among our clients, you know, museums and performing arts centers are already thinking about, you know, having to skip every other seat in theaters, or having to, you know, obviously stand 6 feet apart in lines and things like that. And it's both a, you know, a revenue impact and of course an operating cost impact. And so, you know, thinking about that as a challenge to overcome, not just the, you know, the physical space, but the, you know, the resource needs to do it, I think is really important for a lot of entities out there. But I think, you know, stepping back into the bigger picture, I think another interesting element to think about is how it opens up new meanings of, you know, accessibility in design. And, you know, I think a lot of times we think of it as, you know, access for physical disabled and ADA requirements, things like that. But, you know, it's much different if now we're expanding that to, you know, who is immunocompromised or something like that. I mean, there's no way of knowing who is walking down the street and, you know, taking medications that's, you know, having those impacts. So that's something we need to be thinking about. And I think it expands the, you know, the question out a little bit. And, you know, how do we protect those who are susceptible to COVID? Even to, you know, how do we help protect vulnerable people in general, which is important thing to be thinking about.
Yeah. I'd say the guidelines like the ADA guidelines and the International Building Code, the WELL standards, especially, they've been solving it in a certain way, but for someone, for example, who's visually impaired, to suddenly require them to touch the sign in order to understand what it says, we have to rethink that. We have to relook at our standards across the board. And I really feel that solution in terms of what is the right outcome for how they do adapt, designers and planners, we need to be at the table in terms of redefining what is best practices now, that we have to rethink and expand our view, as you're saying, Daniel. I think that's a really good point, that it now becomes a broader perspective that actually includes all of us in terms of those standards and guidelines now.
Yeah, when thinking about health and safety, I think and even about the universal standards, I think one of the kind of issues that is, I guess, most problematic about it is these are all issues related to health, which are privacy issues. So if we look at things like heat scanning, for example, for temperatures, does a company or an organization have the right to know that information about someone? I know that's kind of a big can of worms to open up, but if we are talking about accessibility, I think we do need to kind of acknowledge that where is the line going to be drawn between what an organization can have for the safety of others in their guidelines and in their technologies versus at what point are you crossing to the privacy of someone else? And I think it's, especially when you talk about immune disorders and stuff, I think it's a really difficult area to kind of all of a sudden be thrusting everyone into, although everybody is. So it'll be a real challenge to see who gets to decide where the line gets drawn between what information people get access to.
Yeah.
And picking up from what Daniel was saying, as well as what Anna was saying, from if there's a whole lot of new regulation and new codes that come in to make to make the space more accessible, more universal, it may be more physically accessible, but to Daniel's point, with all the costs that get added on, we really need to figure out who's going to pay for that. Otherwise, you're really limiting the people that can access it. So if you take a museum, for instance, that is supposed to be this amazing collection of public knowledge and a place for the general public to go and learn, if you've now cut out 70% of the people that could go there, one, it doesn't really make it viable, and two, it's not achieving what its ultimate function is. So there's a really big balance there. So is it on the users to pay? Is it on the institution, or well, the institution pay, but then ultimately is it the users, or is it a government entity? Or are we really hoping that there's going to be a whole lot of corporate response CSR that comes in and says it's our duty as great citizens, as corporate citizens, to make this accessible? And then that would get into all sorts of fun things that Daniel probably sees on the museum side of then who can and can you not take corporate funding from.
And you know, to pick up, there's all sorts of impacts. You know, financially, it expands out to just sort of resource needs in general. And as far as, you know, I mean, I touched on this earlier. You know, who can work from home, who can work in those spaces. We've got, you know, clients talking about having to rotate in their employees, like 1 week on, 1 week off, into spaces, and so that, you know, you've got fewer people in the space itself. And that, you know, becomes a challenge for people to, you know, interact with each other and, you know, get new ideas out there and, you know, create some of the things that we're used to seeing in these spaces. So it has lots of implications as you know, people that we've working with are starting to think through all the different impacts, and it's, you know, it's going to be a challenge for sure.
Yeah, and I would say a reality is most likely in terms of this transition, we're eventually going to get, hopefully there will be a cure. Hopefully, once we are able to get vaccinated, then we can go back to normal, whatever new normal we now have. But the reality there is that's probably 2 years out. And for these cultural institutions that are struggling now, how do we find and define new means of universal design and standards that allow them to operate today, because they can't wait 2 years in order to get us all back safely into the space, and to allow people to feel safe to come out of their home and really do re-engage, rather than just having an online program that, you know, keeps us in our homes, which at least at the moment are free most of the time. And so that's just not viable from an institution standpoint, nor any business really.
Yeah, and I think too, if we're looking at kind of the interim measures, obviously I think capacity limits will be decreased for these institutions. So obviously that will impact their revenue, but also if we think about, at least here in Toronto over the past couple of years, there's been kind of a visible shift in the major institutions to kind of lower the barrier of entry by lowering prices and trying to engage communities outside the downtown core. So what happens now if space is limited and there's all of a sudden a new barrier for these outside communities where the mere act of going is considered a risk after there's been so much time and money invested in trying to bring them out in. So does that mean the shift of these institutions need to mean they need to play a more active role outside of their physical space, and they need to actively do placemaking within communities versus investing and trying to change their physical structure right now? They need, maybe an option is to divert those funds into external programs.
It's interesting.
And I think, you know, just to pick up on that, I mean, you know, this impacts, you know, not just a need for open space, but also sort of civic space, which, you know, from a cultural institutions perspective, is an expansion, or at least a slight expansion of some missions. And so that actually maybe is another opportunity if we're thinking about, you know, how can you pick up on other resources. It may be an agenda that you can, you know, expand the people that you can bring in who might be, you know, interested in funding those sorts of things. I know parks have been somewhat successful at this in recent years, and thinking about how they can be civic spaces or gathering spaces for people but it becomes even more critical to think about how, agendas might expand, or you can, bring in different audiences or interest groups through those means as we move forward.
Okay, good discussion. So obviously with, the current pandemic, there's a lot of doom and gloom scenarios, and we need to be prepared for anything and everything, I suppose. But I would like us to discuss maybe what some of the biggest misconceptions you feel are in regards to what will change in placemaking as a result of the pandemic. So what do you think we might have gotten wrong, or where do you think some areas or opportunities may lie? And Brad, maybe you can give this one a shot.
I think that through all this, ultimately, we're still humans, and we're still going to crave that connection, and we're still going to have the drive for profitability. And I think there's going to be, and we have short memories, and I think, which is probably demonstrated by the fact that a lot of the same measures that we're doing now were done 100 years ago in the last pandemic, and we haven't really advanced a whole lot other than some digital communication in 100 years. So I think we're quickly going to revert. It may be post vaccine, but I think we're quickly going to revert to what we saw beforehand. I think we're going to want to get back out into sporting events. I think office space, I think it may start with sort of partial capacity in an office building, but I think pretty quickly that'll go back to where we were, either because people are comfortable being in closer proximity to their peers, or because company starts growing, the time, there's a big difference in time that a company would need to adjust their space, or the time that the business would grow, and versus if they needed to go out, find a new space, build it out. There's just a very different timeline there. So I think we're gonna get past this, and we're gonna forget about a lot of it, and I think we're gonna revert back to what we had initially. There's certainly some things that hopefully stick. Hopefully, reconnecting with family and all of that. But that's where I see things going. I think we're going to bounce back to where we were.
I do agree. I think in some ways we often are a culture with amnesia, but I do like to think that this has been a wake-up call for everyone, and possibly a positive outcome in terms of misconception could be that the social norm's really been to cram us all in as much as possible. I can say that as someone who's lived in New York City for 19 years. And so, even they've done a sidewalk survey within this, and most sidewalks in New York City, you can't social distance the 6 feet. So my hope is that actually this will create a paradigm of being more humane and allowing spaces actually to be redefined and more inhabitable. And so maybe it will give us a moment of breathing where sidewalks and city paradigms, suddenly there's new mandates in terms of having it be more for the people, the pedestrian. Maybe parks and museums are not so jam-packed, but we are able to have a sense of space and find how do we balance that with not making it a premium where it's suddenly driving out a certain population to not be able to experience it. But hopefully this will allow placemaking to become just embrace the people, embrace space a bit more. So that's my hope, at least.
A good hope.
A good hope.
I guess for me, what I think one of the big misconceptions is this idea that digital can replace physical. And I think all these online concerts and fundraisers and events, I think people have embraced them as much as possible due to the need to on their own social needs. But I think what it's highlighted is that the things we take for granted, especially living in cities, but even living in small towns, like access to community centers, access to museums, things that we have access to every day, I think there's going to be a newfound appreciation for them. my biggest concern in digital is maybe not a hope, but a concern, is this working from home? I have real concerns about how that could impact class divide. And I don't, but who knows which way it's going to go. But it is something that I think is something that the kind of who has the ability to work from home versus who has to go into the cities and risk themselves on transit is something that I hope people take seriously and the city considers, keeps in mind when they're phasing people back into work. So some good, some bad.
Yeah. And I think from my perspective, it's interesting. We've been thinking a lot at work about sort of scenario planning and possible futures with different clients. And so I think, one thing that pops to mind is that, and maybe this a little bit building on what Brad said, is that, I think a misconception is that things are guaranteed to change, or, if they are going to change, that they're going to go in a certain direction. I think we all have to be creative shapers of the future and press for chances to move forward in things that we see as opportunities. And I think, the good news there is that if you think about culture or creativity or whatever sort of formulation you want to put around that, is that those really are sort of anti-fragile in the, in the celeb sense that, the more things are sort of chaotic around us, the more opportunities and the more ways we can find to demonstrate creative ways to come together and connect to others. So I think more than anything, we see it as as hopefully a pause that gives people a chance to remember the things that they really appreciate about places, about their communities, and accentuate those more in the future.
That's a really important point. I wonder, and we touched on this a little bit before, but I wonder whether cultural institutions and the likes can actually wait for us to become comfortable again, to go out there and explore them. And how do we what are the short-term fixes and solutions that we can use as stopgap until we're comfortable again to go out into the world?
Go ahead, Tim.
I think some cultural institutions can wait, and those are probably the ones with endowments. The other ones, I think, because they're not for profits, and so I think there's some real struggle, and that's where I think there's a lot of people looking to government to help fill that in, and which is interesting because this is when we're really turning to culture and the arts to help connect us, and because when you think about it, even if you've conquered everything there is to conquer in the business world and you have all the money you would ever need, what are you and your family going to do to make you happy? You're probably going to do something that's related to culture, be it travel, food, art, ballet, etc. And so I think art and culture has a really important function right now, and I think it's really important that someone steps up and helps save that. I think there's some really interesting examples, both in history, the New Deal that the US had, and more recently, Germany announced a 50 billion euro bailout for their arts and culture sector. But here in North America, Canada has announced 500 million, which is great. But I think there's a lot of institutions that can't wait for the general public to come around unless they have some serious help quite quickly.
Yeah, and maybe I would just comment that I think the cultural institutions have all been moving to digital, like everybody else. But I think that what they're doing, they're doing it so quickly, and they don't have the expertise to do it, that what they're competing against, they're competing on platforms that have huge experiences already, huge audiences already. And the idea that they're kind of going into that space thinking their audience will come with them or they can build an audience, I think is wishful thinking. I think that if we look not immediate, but in short and medium term, as communities start to open up and some of the social distancing rules relax a little bit, not fully, but a little bit, I do think there's a real opportunity for institutions to move into communities and go to the people. And what that looks like, I think, is quite interesting. I'm not sure what it looks like, but this idea that turning spaces into shared spaces, institutions and cultural centers, bringing in other institutions and culture centers, I think there's something that could be really interesting and really novel if they started to look in that path versus a focus on digital.
And I think, there are sort of real difficulties from a business model perspective, I think, moving forward for a lot of cultural institutions, and it's going to take some imagination for how to get around those. As Tim said, the first initial impulse is let's all move to digital. Well, yes, you're competing against organizations or platforms with millions and billions of users, and you've got thousands or at the best sort of hundreds of thousands of users, and it's not a space that at least most cultural organizations have been used to competing in, and the economics of that are really challenging. More generally, I mean, that's the not-for-profit business model, is that the more you do program-wise, the more money you're likely to lose. That's why it's a not-for-profit, and so they have to be careful about how far they go out into communities. But I think, as Tim suggests, there is opportunity there, and you've got to be, creative, not just to, harp on that word over and over, but about how you take those opportunities. And, as I was saying earlier, finding new connections or finding new levers you can pull to build those connections, whether that's just building an audience or whether that's building philanthropic support for some of the things you're doing. It could be, civic space I talked about. It could be, connecting back to, mental health. It could be community building. There are lots of things where arts and culture, do interact with how we see the world, and as a sector, I think, which we we're part of that sector, we need to be a lot better about pulling those levers hard in this time.
All right, wonderful. And this leads very nicely into our audience questions, which is great. So the first question that we have, and thank you audience for submitting the questions. The first question is, any advice for communities trying to plan for public art installations and experiences in the next year, particularly in terms of justifying the expenditure when there are other competing fiscal priorities?
I think it's those enhancements that we can do to the built environment that are going to draw people out. And it automatically makes you, when you see something even just painted brightly, or it's curated in some manner, it feels welcoming, it draws you in, it makes you want to be a part of it because it feels cared for. So I would say it will be a huge part in terms of what we can do from a placemaking perspective to draw people back out and make them feel comfortable within their space and in their community.
Yeah, I would agree with Anna's comment there. I think it's really important. Arts and culture is obviously really important. And I think as hard as financially this is going to be to recover from, I think psychologically, there's going to be a lot that has to go into that. And from a public programming standpoint, or from any standpoint, psychology doesn't pro forma very well. But it is something that needs to be done. And so I think it comes down to strong leadership of whoever is leading that, either community, municipality, institution, to be able to say, no, this is important, and really push to prioritize that with respect to other measures.
I like your phrase, psychology doesn't pro forma very well. But I mean, I do think there are people who sort of make it pro forma in some ways. I mean, if you look at the increase in, businesses that are attuned toward, psychological health, whether that's, meditation apps or, fitness, athleisure brands, things like that. I think there are, more and more places that public art can connect to as a sort of a funder, and it can be seen as a leader and getting us back out there, and hopefully on the other side of this, pulling us back together in our community. So I think yes, we've got to make a clear case, but I think there is a real case to be made, and
Okay.
Yeah. Brad, as a psychologist, I was almost insulted by your psychology. But I
Apologies.
totally agree. It's always been a tricky part of demonstrating the value of psychology and human well-being and mental health. But I think similar to what Anna was talking about a little while ago, is that there might be more of a push for us to be more sensitive to those kind of issues, and might be easier to demonstrate the value and the worth of good placemaking as we move forward. At least I would hope, right?
For sure.
All right. We don't have too much time left, so we're going to keep going with the audience questions. All right, so let's see for this next one. What best practices are you seeing in reimagining placemaking for the long term, especially in animating less developed areas of cities and suburbs in the environment where some restrictions on social gatherings may persist? What types of partnerships may emerge? So long-term placemaking and animating less developed areas of cities and suburbs.
I mean, in terms of business improvement districts and the establishment of those two, I would love Brad's point of view on this in a way, but it's inevitable that I think we need to be focusing on those communities. It goes back to, in a way, the first question that we had of really investing in the local, potentially creating a new sense of brand and identity within that realm. But Brad, do you have a perspective in terms of?
It's an interesting question, because it's not something that you can think about in isolation. I think you need to think of what's going to be the impact on the places that have traditionally already been busy. And so for me, spend a lot of time, one of my big worries is sort of Main Street retail. And if that starts getting hollowed out, what happens to the places that are normally very vibrant? So on the counterpoint, maybe there's an opportunity there, because the places that traditionally haven't been that well developed, maybe it's almost that they're starting at the same point as the places that traditionally were busier. And so going back, to some of the early points, if there's going to be a migration out to less populated areas, then maybe that's sort of the start. That you need more people would maybe start populating those on the residential side, and then maybe just like any area that goes from industrial to sort of industrial to creative, and then starts sort of ramping up the value chain. Maybe, yeah, I think it would need the opportunity to be, you need someone to take a risk on that, either a very long-term landowner that probably owns a lot of it, or government. I'm not sure if that answers the question. It was probably more rambling than anything.
I think it's a really interesting question, because, I asked for best practices. We're all sort of like, finding our way through this period together. And one of the things, if you think about sort of strategy during times of uncertainty, or extreme uncertainty in particular, there's always uncertainty, is, thinking about how you can do little baby steps, or what are little experiments that you can launch here and there, and learn from those in your particular situation. So, I think that might be a best practice, is, now might not be the time to make a huge bet on how to get people into these other spaces, but instead, see if you can do little things along the way, and eke them there, person by person, and then find what works and enhance that.
But it could be too, your idea, Brad, of the storefronts being closed, to imagine those as, there's so many artists that are struggling right now, and so to imagine those as a canvas, either for the cultural institutions or the artists themselves, to suddenly create murals in a temporary means. But there are moments when you experience a city. I know Philadelphia is one that really has a lot of artist murals, and it just suddenly creates a sense of place, and it is just this beautiful thing to experience. Even areas of Brooklyn that have a lot of graffiti in it, but it's done by artists, and it's beautiful. So it makes you appreciate the space more, even if it's in transition and struggling.
I also wonder if, because everyone's feeling so isolated and has a desire to move. I wonder about the idea of a kind of a greater role of partnerships and need for spaces that incorporate health and wellness opportunities,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily even in a formalized way, but in a way that like as set walking paths, for example, that in times like this, that are paths that are distanced enough that they can be used to kind of provide a distraction from your day to day, but there's still safe. So I think there's something in there too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, we only have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to introduce one last question. I think this question probably has to do with the concept of cultural amnesia, so that we're going to move on past all of this. And the question asks, what do you feel your responsibility as designers and strategists is to remind people / integrate, safe and resilient designs in the future when people go back to their normal lives and potentially forget about COVID and what we're currently dealing with? What, for example, social distancing, how do we enforce and keep these things relevant as we move forward and lockdowns are lifted? And what role do we play in framing that conversation?
Yeah.
Sorry. I think one of the most important things to do is design so that there's an ability to turn these measures on and off pretty quickly. And so be it digital or physical, how do we set it up so that we don't have to sort of go through the whole process of figuring out who's doing what, how we do it? Almost, how do we learn from this, create sort of like a playbook? And then how do you design things with that resiliency? We do it in many other ways, like building code, for instance, is full of things that very rarely happen, but we need to do for resiliency. And so how do we do that? How do we expand that out beyond the building, or even expand it in a different way within buildings to create that? I think that's where the big challenge would be. And I think there's actually a lot of potential follow-on benefits from that. Because I think it'll introduce a new flexibility, and then couple that with just general creativity of artists and designers. I think you'll see new ideas emerge out of that.
Yeah, I would agree with Brad about the need to be able to turn it on and off. I think, I don't think it's the kind of the role or the right of the designer to decide everyone needs to follow these rules around the world the same way. Different cultures have different ideas of social space. And just because we have this one rule in place right now because of COVID-19, I don't think we therefore have the right to tell everybody, this is how your culture should be moving forward. I think that's a little bit dangerous.
I agree. I think we can look to embrace certain layers of technology that minimize touch, and like there's certain parts that can be very easy, but then there is the element of we're not going to have lines on the ground for the rest of time in terms of the grocery store. So how do we think about transforming that? But I do love what you're both saying in terms of we can't just put that on as a rule. We have to find what's right within the different areas, as well as really what is the solution that's best in terms of the long term. So that's going to take some exploration. And
maybe to think about the question slightly differently, it's not just about the physical distancing aspects of COVID, but as designers and strategists and creators, we can be the people who remind people of this time in a different way, that it was this pause or this break, and that we don't just go back to our old ways of working or acting or thinking or whatever it may be, but instead think about what other possible futures are and how we can imagine those together.
I think that's a wonderful statement, and perhaps our closing statement, unless anybody has anything else to add to the conversation. No. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, for tuning in. We will be continuing this conversation offline and developing some of these thoughts and ideas which we can share with the audience. So stay tuned. Again, panelists, thanks for coming, and really appreciate the conversation, and hope everybody has a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.